Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of The Best of Pedalshift. On this edition, we go all the way back to July 2019 to edition number 171 of the Pedalshift project and covering bike touring on busy roads. You know, sometimes our bike tours mean sharing the road with a lot of motorized vehicle traffic. On this episode, we covered some tips and tricks on bike touring on those busy roads. Hope you enjoy. Next up on the show is The Lab, and The Lab is the part of the show where we talk about, experimental stuff, things having to do with the nuts and bolts of bike touring. And on this episode, we are going to be taking a cue from a listener. Sadly, I have lost the identity of the listener who suggested this topic for the episode. I am so sorry. If you are listening, please let me know that this was your idea, because this was totally your idea. It was a great idea, and I've managed to be a numbskull and lose any reference whatsoever to your identity, so I could say, thank you, individual who came up with this, not me. Anyways, thank you. This is riding on busy roads. This is a topic that comes up all the time when I'm in conversations with folks, in particular, who are either brand new to touring and are worried about riding on roads with other vehicles, or they've done a lot of touring, but they've been very focused on trails or separated bike infrastructure. There's a feeling out there amongst a lot of folks, understandable, that riding with cars gives them a lot of fear, especially on some of these great routes that are out there that I talk about a lot. The Pacific Coast route comes to mind. You know, I just got done doing a chunk of the Oregon coast, and there are portions of that ride where I've got cars that are going 55, 65 miles per hour over my left shoulder, passing me up or down hills, and I've got about 3 feet of distance between my shoulder and them. And for a lot of folks, that can be a deal breaker, and that's understandable. If that's the case, don't do it. Do not ride roads. If this is a deal breaker for you, don't do it. There's plenty of other ways to do bike touring. There's bike packing. There's other trails. There's things like that. You can do it. However, if you are like, I really want to do a ride like the Pacific Coast route, like some of these other routes that have road components to them or all road, but you want some tips on how to handle riding on these busy roads, well, this is sort of a brain dump from me to you on how I handled that and how I've gotten to the point right now where even on the busiest roads, honestly, I don't think about it anymore. And it's not that I don't take care of myself and I don't do things to give myself safety in the face of all of this. However, I don't think about traffic passing me and I don't get stressed out about it. Now, I think part of that is I've just gotten used to it. And I think part of it is also some of the other things that I'm going to talk about. So anyways, let's go through this list of things on dealing with riding on busy roads, especially if you're a newcomer to things. If you've been around a little bit, I think there's some tips here that might be kind of helpful for you. You might learn a thing or two, so stick around. So number one, if I would say, if you're new to all of this, if you're new to riding on roads, the first thing I would say is practice near home. One of the things that I think that I've noticed over time for me, the reason why I don't have that fear anymore is because I've ridden thousands of miles, hopefully thousands of miles by this point, on pretty busy roads, on major highways. And, you kind of get used to it after a while. The concept of how much space you feel comfortable with kind of shrinks over time. Now, the one caveat I would say is I think that probably changes if you've had an incident on a road like that. I have been very fortunate. I've never had a situation where I've had a near miss or an issue. I have never been clipped. I've never been run off a road. I've never had any of those things. Some of that may be some of the things that I do to give myself that extra bit of space and to make sure that the vehicles that see me and respond accordingly. But if you're new to it, practice. Get out there on roads that are progressively busier. Start on something that has a great big shoulder. Well, start on something with a bike lane, maybe an unprotected bike lane where all that is paint. Move on to maybe sharrows. Move on to other places where it's a shoulder, but it's pretty wide, and then keep continuing to go to a point where it's essentially a 3-foot buffer that you've got, maybe with no real shoulder that you've got going on, and just practice. Now, don't do this in silly places. Don't do this in places where it's not legal or not advisable, very busy roads that don't see any bike traffic. I would say go to Strava and look at the heat map and find different areas. Use Google Maps to give you your directions, but practice near home, and don't do anything that is really, really beyond what your comfort zone is, but push yourself. Give yourself a little bit of a push every single time you do it. Do something that scares you maybe a little bit, or, that's a bit of a stretch. That's what I would recommend to start. The other thing that I've noticed recently, actually just today, is the Washington Area Bicycle Association, or WABA, is one of our kind of advocacy groups here in the DC area. Really great group. They do city riding lessons. They have a whole class around that. So check your local bike shop, check your local bike club or advocacy group or whatever, and find out if there's some kind of a class that helps you understand more about defensive, not necessarily city riding, but road riding, because there's lots and lots of places to go. If that's not available, maybe your local bike club would kind of help you out with all of this. Maybe take you out. They're going to do rides that maybe help people ramp up to get to that point. So those are the two things that I would say to get used to things a little bit more, because it's a very mental game when all is said and done. The next thing that I would recommend for you, once you've gotten to the point where you're like, okay, I can do this. I'm not frozen in terror with riding my bike on the road. Here's a bunch of different things that you should consider doing that will help minimize being in traffic or a lot of traffic. The first thing I would say is time your ride. Try not to ride during peak hours or at peak times. Now, that may be hard to avoid. I'll use the Oregon coast, for example. I rode on a weekend in the summer. I mean, there is no more high-end time than riding on a weekend in summer on the Oregon coast. That's peak time. But if you've got an opportunity to do things on off times, maybe during the middle of the week, doing tours during those off times, if that's part of what your availability is, that can be helpful. There's less traffic. There's less stuff to deal with. Don't ride during rush hours if you can all avoid it, because frankly, that can kind of suck, especially if you're in a city area. Time your ride. Next thing is something that I've gotten to the point where I say this is almost a complete necessity. I really strongly urge anybody who's bike touring, where you're going to be in and about traffic with motorized vehicles, or frankly, really other bikes too. Even on trails, I use this. Get a mirror. Now, the right mirror for you may be different from the right mirror for me or for someone else. There are all sorts of different types out there, and people are very particular about the mirrors that they choose to use. I know I am. I don't care for the clip-on mirror that goes on your glasses or on your helmet. For some people, that's the only way to go. For me, I like the kind that attach to, well, in my case, not really my handlebar, but it's complicated. I have a mirror that attaches onto my bike, whether it's on your handlebar or onto an extender pole or something like that. You know, whatever ends up working best for you, go for it. That, after a lot of trial and error with the clip-on style on the glasses and whatnot, I just could never get my eyes to work really well with that. I run into people all the time that use those types of mirrors and swear by them and will never use anything else. There's too much vibration on the handlebar styles. There's lots of good reasons not to use the kind that I prefer. So I would say try them out. Most mirrors are not super expensive. So you know what? If you try one and it's not for you, well, try something else. But I really recommend getting a mirror. I talked about this in recent podcasts. It gives you the opportunity to know what the traffic is behind you. You know when you can just take a lane. You know when there's a vehicle that's approaching, especially one that's larger. And if the situation on the road ahead of you is no good and you need to bail out, it gives you the opportunity to do that. It gives you more information. There are some people that prefer just turning their head back. And if that is what works for you, I say great, but I would say please try a mirror as well, or first if you haven't. I've ridden with a few people who are like, look, I've tried every type of mirror and I don't like it any more than just kind of turning and craning my neck back. That's what works for me. awesome. But I would definitely say getting a mirror can be a really, really big boon to your riding. So no disrespect to your mirrorless folks, but I would say if you've never tried one, try a few and see if you can use one, because I can't say that I don't ride without one, because occasionally I'll be on a bike, I'll be like, oh shoot, I left my mirror's not on this bike. But for longer tours, man, there's nothing quite like having a mirror on there. Next up, be visible. It is perhaps asking too much of drivers in vehicles to, I don't know, pay attention to what's in front of them, especially us defenseless riders who are not encased in a whole bunch of metal and airbags and things like that. However, I'm also a driver, and frankly, I like it when I run into bicyclists who are extra visible, because why? I get a little bit of extra information a little bit sooner because of that. Now, does that mean that you have to ensconce yourself in neon yellow and flashing lights? Maybe, if that's what works for you. But I would say that, depending on the conditions that you've got, make sure you've got your bike lights. Make sure that you're not blending into your environment. So don't be there was an old Saturday Night Live sketch where there was a Halloween costume. It was called Invisible Pedestrian. It was basically a black turtleneck and black pants. So don't blend into the night. Don't try to be stealth while you're riding. That is the last time you should be stealth at all. Be visible. However that works for you and however you feel comfortable with that. I have seen people wearing vests that literally light up like a Christmas tree. That is not for me, but if it's good for you, awesome, go for it. I'm perfectly cool with my One Good Light by Portland Design Works. And as you know, I'm usually ensconced fabulously in orange, which is a pretty visible color. So I'm visible and I feel pretty comfortable with all of that. That helps because it means that you're going to be, more visible to folks that need to know where you're at. The next one is a newish one that I have seen before, but I think has been made relatively famous in a semi-viral post that was put up by Annalisa Vandenberg of the Miles of Portraits folks. And I know that she uses a pool noodle. I know that Eric, her partner in crime over there at Miles of Portraits, I think he was using his tripod, if I'm not mistaken, wrapped in solar LED lights or something like that. The idea here is to create a 3-foot wide pole of some kind that comes out on your left-hand side or on your right-hand side if you're cycling in a country where you're cycling on the opposite side of what we do in the States, to make sure that vehicles respect that much distance. I don't usually have a problem with vehicles that come closer than that. I probably can count on one hand the number of times that's happened. I am very lucky because I know lots of people who get that on a daily basis in their commute, and that just sucks. So this is, I think, a unique and interesting trick that you can use to make sure that you are claiming the space that you legally have a right to have. At least here in the States, and I think almost every state that I'm aware of, there is a 3-foot pass rule. Some of them actually are longer than that, but I think 3 feet is very reasonable to put on your bike. The reason why I think a pool noodle is a great idea is that it's kind of floppy and bendy, and if it does happen to get struck by an RV or by a truck or by somebody in a car, it's gonna thwack, but it's not gonna spill you like something that's a little bit more hard shaped. I've seen a lot of people put jokes up there saying, I'm gonna put a pickaxe or a spiked baseball bat on there. Haha, very funny, but you're going to end up in a ditch if you get hit by that. So not a great idea. Pool noodle, great idea. I think that works. I've never used it. I understand people that do. I would consider doing that in places where I felt like the shoulder situation, the traffic situation was more aggressive. I know that Annalisa and Eric had that in Alaska in particular, and that's why they started using it. So I think that's a great idea. They're cheap. They're easy to get. You can get them in dollar stores. You can get them in all sorts of different places. And that means you don't necessarily have to pack one on if you're traveling to go there. Next up, this one I think is the most important thing, and I think that this applies everywhere. I ride a lot in the city. I live in the District of Columbia here in Washington, D.C. I think that the worst thing you can do as a cyclist is to act unpredictably. And I think that's the biggest criticism that I hear of folks who drive motor vehicles is, oh, bicyclists blow through stop signs and I never know when to stop or go. And frankly, when I'm in a vehicle, sometimes I'll be sitting there and I just don't know if a bike is going. It's gotten so bad that sometimes I like to tend to stop, especially at four-way stops in my neighborhood, as if I were a motorized vehicle, following the rules as one is supposed to. And sometimes vehicles will be surprised that I'm actually doing that, and there'll be this long pause, and I'm like, oh, for crying out loud, go, it's your turn, But they're expecting me to kind of blow through. And I think that all goes to the whole notion of what's predictable and what's not. And we've gotten to a point in a lot of places where we don't even know what bicyclists or vehicles are going to be doing because they're unpredictable. The following of rules is kind of not the best out there. And so there's the assumption that vehicles or bikes or people riding bikes will not follow the rules. And so then you get chaos. So here's what I would say. Try to be as predictable as possible. Use hand signals. Make sure that if there is a stop sign and there's another vehicle that has gotten there before you, come to a stop or at least slow way down and let them go through because they have the right of way. I'm a fan of the Idaho stop law, which basically says that bicycles treat stop signs as yield signs. So in other words, if the traffic is clear and you've got a stop sign, you don't have to come to a complete stop. You can treat it as a yield and make sure that there's no traffic coming and go through it. Now, frankly, that is not the law in the District of Columbia, or frankly, in many, many places out there. It's on the verge of becoming law in Oregon. I think that it's fine practice. You do you ride your ride. Everyone has their own kind of rules. But I have to be honest, I think most motor vehicles in DC follow the Idaho stop rule. And I've seen it in a lot of places too. So anyways, point being, be as predictable as possible. Make sure that someone that is behind you or ahead of you or beside you knows what your next move is to the extent that you can communicate that. Communication is a very important thing. So do that if you can. That makes a huge difference. It makes a huge difference if you're going to be taking a lane. It's going to be a huge difference if you're coming to an intersection, you're going to be making a turn. It is so important if you are especially making a left-hand turn, I find. Because, of course, you're generally, not always, but you're generally going to be on the right-hand side. You're going to come out into the lane. You're maybe going to have to cross a couple of lanes to get to a left turn lane. And, you want to make sure people know that you're actually turning left there and to treat you as a vehicle turning left through that intersection. Because, frankly, sometimes if they don't know that, they may think, oh, they're just going straight. It's good to communicate. Use those hand signals. And if you don't know the hand signals, Google them, look them up. I think it's important that every person who is on a bicycle tour know and be able to use hand signals. Next step, don't be afraid to take the lane when it's legal or get on a sidewalk when it's legal. I do both. If I am in a place where there is very crowded traffic to the point of congestion, often I'll hop on sidewalks. This was particularly true last tour in Oregon. There are times in Lincoln City where the traffic just builds up, and you know what? You're better off being in the sidewalk. Now, there's issues with that. There's the pedestrian issue, and you want to be mindful of pedestrians. There's the fact that when you go through crosswalk cuts that are into parking lots, sometimes cars are not looking for you. So be very, very, very mindful of all of that. Again, drivers are not necessarily thinking that there's going to be a bicyclist or someone on a bike going on a sidewalk through that area. And you're going faster than they're typically thinking that someone who's a pedestrian is. Is that the right point of view? No, they should be looking. However, again, we're living in the real world here. So you want to make sure that you are being smart when you're in these places. If you're taking the lane, signal. Make sure you've got space. Don't just cut right out. I've seen in a couple of instances where folks who are on bikes will just cut right out into traffic, and the person who is driving a motor vehicle really has to slam on their brakes because it's way too quick. It's way too soon for them to be able to react, and they weren't expecting because they didn't see a hand signal that you were changing a lane. whenever you're in a shoulder or in a bike lane and you're moving out into another lane, that is changing a lane just like you are as a driver in a motorized vehicle. And what do you have to do? You have to use your turn signal. So make sure you're doing that. Make sure you're offering the same courtesy when you are taking the lane. It is your right to do that in many, many, many states. It's your right to do that in many places on this fine planet Earth. Your laws may vary. Make sure you know what the laws are in your jurisdiction, your country, your place where you are cycling. And that kind of leads into the last thing. Always remember, you as a bicyclist belong on those roads just as much as motorized vehicles. But also balance that with the fact that you're way, way, way more vulnerable. You're not ensconced in airbags and metal and crumple zones and things like that. You are the crumple zone, I'm sorry to say, my friend. So take precautions and stay safe. But I'm here to tell you, my life is so much richer than it would have been if I had just stuck to the trails for me. And I'm really, really glad that I've gotten to the point where I don't fear. I have a healthy respect of riding on busy roads, but I don't fear it anymore. And I don't know if I ever did, but I certainly I take calculated, reasonable risks when I go out there on a bicycle. And I would say for every one of you, and this is true generally from a bicycle touring perspective, know what the risks are when you're getting involved with it and take calculated measures. Give yourself every chance for the safety that you can possibly attain for yourself, and go out there and ride your ride. I can't give you the advice that will automatically protect you. That is why, I always say, you're riding at your own risk when you go out there and do these things. That's the lawyer in me, right? But at the same time, we can all take reasonable precautions. We can practice best practices. We can use hand signals. We can have mirrors. We can time our rides. We can do all of these different things to make sure that we are better at riding on busy roads. And that's it. Here's a quick rundown. Practice near your home. Take a class at a local bike shop or a bike club. Time your ride. Get a bike mirror. Be visible. Try the pool noodle trick if you want to. Be predictable and use hand signals and other types of things. Don't be afraid to take the lane where legal and get on a sidewalk where legal. And always remember, you belong on the roads just as much as motorized vehicles. But be mindful that you're vulnerable, so take precautions. And that's it for riding on busy roads. Thank you for joining. You can find Pedalshift at pedalshift.net for more great bicycle touring content. You can hear the Pedalshift project through Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. Opening music courtesy of Jason Kent off his self-titled album. The track is called America. Check out his band Sunfield's latest release, Mono Mono, wherever cool music is available.